I have here in my hands a list of names. Names that have been provided to the Federal Bureau of Investigation of affiliates of the Communist Party who nevertheless still worked and shaped policy in one of the largest women's organizations in US history. These are the FBI files of the YWCA. Here I have just a couple of the CIA documents about the Maryknoll Sisters. YWCA, an ecumenical women's organization, a volunteer organization. Its roots stretch to the 1850s. Maryknoll Sisters are a Roman Catholic religious congregation, the first congregation of women religious in the United States to send women into foreign mission. And so I want to look at the perhaps unlikely chapter in the Red Scare, in the history of Red Scares in the United States, in the history of radicalism and religion. But also, my inquiry starts with religious life and American politics in the present day. It's become fairly well established that evangelicalism has become a dominant force in American political life. Mainline Protestantism had a certain cultural hegemony, but they've been supplanted by evangelicals since the Reagan years, who have decisively shaped foreign policy and domestic social legislation. So a swirl of factors produce the ascendancy of evangelical politics. Certainly there are demographic matters, the explosive rise in evangelical congregations, coupled with a steady decline in membership in mainline churches. There are cultural ones. Historians identify the 1960s as a breaking point. On one side, the concerns of church leaders for issues, social issues like civil rights, anti-war issues, they far outpace those of their congregants. And from another angle, in the words of historian David Hollinger, these churches lost many of their children to a post-Protestant secularism. Who said one has to be Christian to do the right thing? The mainline churches yielded much of the symbolic capital of Christianity to their evangelical rivals. So in other words, liberal Protestants ceded the mantle of Christian politics in becoming ecumenical, in downplaying theology in favor of widening the scope of religious reform. My talk today is an attempt to be a corrective or maybe a modification of that way of explaining the rise of evangelical politics and the religious right. Because when I looked into the Maryknoll Sisters and the YWCA, I found that they did not yield the mantle of Christian politics to evangelicals. It wasn't ceded, it was seized. And so I make reference to a long Red Scare to explain this. Why long Red Scare? The Red Scare is these concerted, often extra-legal measures of suppressing leftist thought in the United States. They're typically discussed as occurring in two waves, both following the world wars. And that periodization captures the intensity and reach of anti-radical efforts at particular moments in time. But it doesn't capture the persistence, the targeted attacks that in their repetition made the social ideals of mainline churches illegible and illegitimate in American public life. And so I don't really have the opportunity to give the long view of this long Red Scare, but I hope that by looking at a couple of incidents, I can give a sense of the scope, the persistence, and the toll of these attacks. My look into the long Red Scare is premised on the instrumentality of women in religion and political life. And so the corrective here too is that while Red Scares are typically discussed in terms of labor unions, cultural producers, political organizations, I think it's important to highlight that campaigns to suppress radicalism were very much part of 20th century women's movements on both sides of the spectrum, of the political spectrum. So there's important intersections in the institutional structures and theological commitments of Mary Noll and the YWCA, but I'll discuss them separately and chronologically, starting with attacks on the YWCA that occur between the 1930s and the 1950s. So a little bit about the history of the YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association of the USA. It's one of the most important and far-ranging organizations in U.S. women's history. It has its origins in mid-19th century evangelical groups that dedicated themselves to collective prayer and social services for women alone in the city. And that picture in the corner there gives you a little sense of where they were coming from. That's 19th century publicity, that picture of that woman wandering the hostile streets of the city. It was inspired by, but always independent from, the Young Men's Christian Association, and it became very famous for the tangible social services that it provided, things like housing, job training, and recreation. By the 1920s, it was the third largest women's organization in the U.S. There are hundreds of local associations in every sort of community, and its reach was international. The overall conceit of association was to bridge social divisions among women, and it was successful in doing so in that it had a considerable contingent of working class women who participated in the programs. It was interracial, though that of course does not mean that segregation, racism didn't exist. And there was an extensive array of programming directed at immigrant families in the United States and directed outward at building transnational connections. So the first point in the red baiting of the YWCA starts around 1920, when its special focus on working women is no longer expressed simply through this desire for the spiritual uplift of potentially wayward souls. In 1920, the organization endorsed legislation that would give workers the right to organize into unions. And that was a very controversial step for any sort of mainstream organization in 1920, let alone a women's religious organization. At that point, the attacks really seemed to be part of the fringe. The YWCA had a cloak of respectability. It had a very favorable public profile, and so it was able to shake off this type of attack. The first rumblings of what would really ensnare the YWCA in the McCarthy era of anti-radical campaigns came with the creation of the Congressional Committee charged with monitoring subversion in the U.S. government, the Dees Committee, which was the predecessor to the House Un-American Activities Committee. An informant named Kenneth Goff identified YWCA Secretary Rose Turlin as member of the Communist Party, said that she had attended communist meetings. And she was the staff advisor to student groups. She also produced a lot of writings about Christian social action. She'd been trained as an economist and was a big supporter of Christian-inflected New Deal era economic planning. It was pretty easy for her to defend herself against Goff's attacks because she had documentation that she was out of the country on the days that he said she was at Communist Party meetings. So she was cleared before the committee, and that was the end of the investigations. This was 1939. The burst of anti-radicalism fades away amidst mobilization for the World War. But it comes back with a vengeance in 1946. And the simple fact of having been named once provides this endless grist for what is no longer a fringe preoccupation. Just that one incident becomes enough for this to snowball into a much larger campaign. The exoneration really doesn't matter. The testimony would become referenced again and again by anti-communist critics as proof that YWCA women rendered yeoman service to the Communist Party and its front organizations, as Congressional Representative George Dondero charged in 1946. In their vehemence, these Perrys would put the YWCA in a vulnerable position, and they began to have an impact on its reputation and accordingly the fundraising. So in 1948, we get some sustained attention to the nexus between Christian practice and subversive social action as Joseph Camp devotes an entire tract to uncovering YWCA subversion. So you see in behind the lace curtains of the YWCA this lacy overlay on the YWCA insignia, suggesting that this respectable space is hiding communism. And then, of course, the sickle and hammer replacing the C in the name. And so Camp promised to reveal a comprehensive array of infiltration, and so you see a denunciation of its interracialism, of its labor politics, but he really goes in on what he calls its revolution with or religion with a revolutionary flavor. The YWCA's religious identity, he writes, was a deliberate subterfuge that injected anti-capitalist, anti-Christian, and anti-American propaganda into religious activity. So it's a paradox. You have the YWCA's Christianity being anti-Christian. YWCA leaders certainly thought of the organization as Christian, even as they eliminated programming like Bible study and devotions, which its religious director wrote in the late 1920s. She said that these no longer gave the association its dynamic for living. So they held to a politicized social gospel, even as the social gospel lost its traction in theological circles, when Reinhold Niebuhr assailed this optimistic confidence in the ability of love to transform the social order. YWCA women continued to hold out the possibilities for love as a transformative force, and they continued to locate the practice of Christian faith in ethical personal development and social consciousness. One of the big thrusts of their programming was promoting boundary-crossing fellowship as the starting point for the Christianization of society. It was the realization of the social ethics promoted by Jesus in the gospel. So that's where you get that pioneering interracial work, where black and white students come together in summer camps and study groups with the idea that these one-on-one encounters would start an interconnected chain of relationships that go from the individual to the community and then outward into the world. An early public affairs publication said something of this in saying, "Women must see in citizenship an opportunity to set into motion an ever-widening circle of friendship, which shall reach from the woman in a small Ohio village to an isolated group in India." So the answer to strife and structural injustice started with learning to love one's neighbor, and then it was put into practice on the structural level by using the tools of representative democracy. So the YWCA comes up with this idea of Christian citizenship, that this is the modern method of religious practice. For Joseph Camp and his ilk, of course, this is a subterfuge. And the declining emphasis on the relationship of the individual to the divine, their modernistic approach to worship, and their voter education materials meant to him that red revolutionists and confirmed atheists found ready acceptance in YWCA circles. So in this regard, with the religious programming, YWCA women are calculating, they're duplicitous, they're using the veneer of religion to draw people into communism. And he finds a lot of problems in their public affairs material, the poisonous paragraphs on public affairs, that he summarized the content as, "Hurrah for Russia, down with the USA." So YWCA endorsements included the New Deal expansion of the social welfare state, efforts for world governance, these very optimistic visions of harnessing the power of the state to create a mutually cooperative society. But of course, after the war, those types of endorsements were highly suspect, and anti-communists gathered power at both the grassroots and the highest level of government. So Camp occupies a place truly on the fringe. He was among the realm of professional anti-Semites and conspiracy theorists. And I want you to note the uncle of John Voight, okay, who continued some of his politics. These are some other individuals involved in the early red baiting of the YWCA. There's Elizabeth Dilling, who wrote several pamphlets denouncing the Ys. That's her at her sedition trial. And then Kenneth Goff, that informant who named Rose Turlin, was a protege of Christian Identity founder Gerald L.K. Smith. So it goes from being the province of people like this to being a preoccupation at the highest level of government. And so the House Un-American Activities Committee itself highlights the Christian communist connection in a federally distributed pamphlet, and it singles out the YM and YWCA. So is every YWCA a communist hideout, it asks. No, but they've dug into such groups and are at it today. And so this is kind of a typical characteristic of anti-communist attacks on women. They're dupes, they're being taken advantage of. But at the same time, it places a scrutiny, HUAC places a scrutiny on the social Christianity, the underpinnings, the theological underpinnings of its programming. And the pamphlet charged that communist policies were disguised as welfare work for minorities or oppressed groups. And that capacious construction of what constitutes the Communist Party line made any sort of call for political or social change evidence of infiltration. And the YWCA had long put forward a public affairs program that sought to ameliorate the conditions of oppressed groups. So I think that this right here is an especially important moment for recognizing that the considerable tradition of the social gospel doesn't fade away from the American consciousness. It's pushed out. The face of liberal Protestantism, Reinhold Niebuhr, insulated himself from that type of attack by adding moral gravitas to aggressive anti-communism.